Before we begin, I'd like to give credit to Commonwealth Games for his video, Hyrule is Rome. This was the main inspiration for this video essay. Now, with that being said, let's begin. The Legend of Zelda needs no introduction, if you know anything about video games, that is. But if you're not aware. You play as a twink called Link, and your mission is to save Hyrule. Throughout the years, the land of Hyrule and the games have had many different iterations. Some with more gritty art styles, some with more cartoonish art styles, and then you just have polygons. However, the majority of the games follow three characters: the hero, the embodiment of courage; the descendant of the goddess Hylia, the embodiment of wisdom; and the descendant of Demise, the embodiment of strength. The hero is you, Link, the elf boy who wields the Master Sword, a blade blessed by the goddess Hylia that seals the darkness away. The descendant of Hylia is the Princess Zelda, who usually holds back the darkness until the hero arrives, and together they smite the evil and entrap the darkness into the Master Sword. Finally, the descendant of Demise is usually called Ganondorf, a son of the Gerudo, an all-female tribe, and is usually labelled as the Demon King. He's primarily the antagonist of these games. They form the core of the world, the Triforce, imagery that comes up a lot throughout the games and pop culture in general. With the most recent installment, Tears of the Kingdom, we see much heavier referencing to the lore of the games, which Breath of the Wild, the predecessor, moved away from. On the surface, these games can draw many parallels with medieval culture, with its castles, weaponry, and most common comparison, King Arthur. However, the developers have had inspiration from other cultures, like the Sheikah having ancient Japanese-style housing. Many weapons in the game share similarities with katanas, and the dragons follow more Eastern ideas, although you do get much more Western-style dragons in certain games. With this being said, I wish to move further away, both in time and geographically, and focus on the ancient world in the Mediterranean, looking at the culture of the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Trojans. We'll start with the architecture of the games does change on each entry, although they all carry very similar medieval buildings. But the more classical buildings take inspiration from multiple Mediterranean civilizations. I feel like this is quite obvious, but these buildings stem from Egyptian culture. Although some could consider they more look like Inca and Aztec, these certainly shaped after the ancient wonder of the world. It could be argued that this Colosseum follows a medieval layout. However, where would that design be without the Flavian amphitheatre? Here in the recent entries, these house animalistic enemies that use strong weapons, similar to how Colosseums would house animal fights and strong gladiators. The Colosseum in Twilight Princess has the execution of Ganondorf, which is similar to how emperors would have the executions in the Colosseum. This does from the outside look like a medieval church. However, the most important element takes heavy inspiration from early Christian Roman churches. Taking a look at the structure in Ocarina of Time, the room that houses the Master Sword has much more of a circular and domed appearance. This kind of architecture is what Romans were famous for, well, that and arches. However, it's not just the architecture that takes inspiration from classical civilization. It's also at first glance, the map of Hyrule from Breath of the Wild did not look anything like the map of Europe or the map of ancient Rome. However, with enough delusion, you can see the similarities to the Mediterranean. Firstly, and most obviously, is that Hyrule Castle, like Rome, is in the centre of the map, or at least near enough to make it the jumping off point. This, from a gameplay perspective, is just a way to create an end goal that fits the style of Breath of the Wild, as you can complete all the surrounding areas to ready yourself, or you can head straight there with an easy, in quotes, and quick path to the end of the game. The areas of the game can therefore just be bogged down to good game making, as the harder parts of the game, like the desert area and snowy area, are blocked off by mountain ranges. You can only get through a certain path, or you can try climb over, which is possible, but is made a lot more difficult if you don't have a high enough stamina bar. Although the Gorons are equally hidden away in the mountains, the player is gestured to visit them, as from the POV of Breath of the Wild. You go from the Zora to the Gorons, as they are right next to each other, and at this point you have some experience dealing with the hardships you face when venturing to Death Mountain. However, we're not talking about coincidences, so when layering over the maps, there are similarities that just make sense from a lore perspective. To the desert area and the Gerudo, it isn't such a stretch to compare them to Carthage. Although their roots were probably more Amazonian, the most famous enemies of the Romans, Carthage was found in North Africa. The Gerudo at some point were the most powerful civilization in Hyrule. In Ocarina of Time, they were taking on the Hylians, the Zora, and the Gorons with the aid of the monsters that roamed around the fields, who served the King of Demons Ganondorf.
On one side we have the Gerudo, on the other the Royal Army, and the Sheikah, and the Zora, and possibly the Goron. Wow, not very even.
Ganondorf was a Gerudo, the leader, one of the only male Gerudo they had. Only one was born every 100 years. The Gerudo we visit in Breath of the Wild is just a small portion of their might. Some of it is shown in Tears of the Kingdom and in Ocarina of Time. After the defeat of both civilizations, they were destroyed by Rome and Hyrule, but the Gerudo then became very powerful allies of the Hylians when it came to the Great Calamity of Breath of the Wild and Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. Finally, the southwest corner of the map is just desert that leads to an invisible barrier. This could be similar to how the Roman Empire sort of just stops moving into Africa, as to them it's just an endless desert and there's nothing of interest and nothing worth the risk of moving troops through the desert. Looking to the northwest of Hyrule, there could be similarities to the Gauls and the Britons. The Rito are humanoid birds that live in cold mountains and are built for the cold, not too dissimilar to the Gauls, who live in colder and harsher climates from northern France. Looking at Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, the Rito do war against the Hylians, as they have a general disdain for outsiders. Although this is mostly ratified by the time of Breath of the Wild, Rivali, the champion, is still Alphaleg, the champion of the Hylians. This could be referenced to the constant on and off fighting of the Romans and the Gauls. To the northeast of the map, the Gorons are not very similar to the Germanics, as even though they're both renowned for their hard skin, whether literal or figuratively, and are less sophisticated in their methods, Germanics were very aggressive towards the Romans. This is the exact opposite to the Gorons in the game. The Gorons are introverted, they keep to themselves, but when they find themselves in social situations, they're very kind towards all people of Hyrule. In Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, one or two of them can be more aggressive towards the hero, but still, the majority of the civilization can be neutral with hospitable mannerisms. Like how there were fewer hostile Gorons than there were kind ones, certain Germanics had much friendlier relations with the Romans. Majority of them lived on the border and allied themselves to defend them from more aggressive tribes. There are stories from the Imperial era of Germans visiting Rome, looking at the sights and visiting the theatres. The Zora to the east of Hyrule fit more in line with the Greeks, as one of the Hylians' longest and greatest allies. like how the Republic began to grow more in Italy, Rome became more involved with Greek diplomacy. The Greeks, however, do differ quite a bit in the beginning of their relationship with Rome. When Rome first intervened with Greece, it offered aid to Athens and their allies against Philip of Macedon. After many skirmishes and years of Rome backing Athens with military and diplomatic aid, Rome was able to start its influence. Some mark this as the beginning of the end of Greek sovereignty, as many ambassadors from the city-states began worrying that Rome's physical presence in the footholds of Greece gave it leverage if they ever wanted to take over. Well, fast forward the past Macedonian War and Punic War, where Rome completely wipes Carthage off the face of the earth, and they keep Greece mainly intact, but more of like a museum rather than a functioning civilization. Although the emergence of Hateno could be seen as a reference to Rome's takeover, Hateno fits more neatly into another category that I'll be talking about later. Zora's domain remained solely Zora's and did not get taken over by the Hylians. It could be more similar to how Rome would ally itself with kingdoms outside its borders. To conclude, the geography of the map and the locations of the different races can be used as a way of mapping ancient Europe onto Hyrule. Although the Gorons and the Rito are much more of a stretch, the Zora, Hylians and Gerudo do have a fair few comparisons, being representations of the Greeks and Carthaginians, with Ganondorf himself having ties to Hannibal. He is the closest to the Gerudo to destroy Hyrule and pulls his influence from the monsters surrounding their areas, like how Hannibal arrives in Italy and starts pulling power from the neighbouring villages of the northern tribes. This was the main point that gave me the idea for this video essay. It, although could be seen as coincidence or delusion, I believe this is purposeful. This is an in-depth study into the movement of the Hylians during the Great Calamity and their migration to the east of Hateno. This migration is very similar to how the Roman civilization had slowly moved their efforts to Byzantium until the fall of Rome, where Byzantium became the powerhouse of the Mediterranean. Hateno's history in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is intertwined with the events that are presented in Age of Calamity. With this memory and battle, we witnessed the last of the Hylians hold at Hateno Fortress, and they were able to keep their evil back, but to the sacrifice of Link. Looking at the map, the geographical and man-made defense of Hateno can be aligned with Constantinople and how it really had one entrance, as its natural defenses, like the rivers and the mountains, kept evil at bay. With Hateno, although the main feature of Breath of the Wild is being able to go anywhere in whatever way, you're encouraged to follow a particular route of least resistance, and that route leads you to Hateno after seeing another village. But to draw back more onto this, Hateno became the sole living space for Hylians after the Great Calamity, as Commonwealth Games suggests 90% of the Hylians were wiped out, and what was left and what had the most technological stuff was Hateno Village. It was the most powerful when it came to technology and when it came to military. However, when we visit it in Breath of the Wild, it is just a small village with the technology base at the top. There are different places on the map that suggest other major settlements of the Hylians before the Great Calamity, that being surrounding the Great Plateau. The Temple of Time, the ruined buildings, and the Colosseum alongside the large flags are key pieces of evidence that there were two major towns for Hylians. Taking this into consideration, the claim here can be invalid when presenting Hateno as a representation of Byzantium. 90% of the Hylians were wiped out in this attack. Hateno was still a town with its technology centre as shown by Pura. So it could just as easily be said that 10% of the Hylians were already in Hateno. No one from Castletown and Great Plateau brought their wealth with them, as there are not many houses in the village, no guards, no soldiers. The only school was built by Zelda after the events of Breath of the Wild. However, during Link's final moments and the events that unfold in Age of Calamity, there must have been some sort of key migration, as shown by Hateno, Hateno Fortress, and the other fortress around this area. It isn't too much of a stretch to assume that the 10% left all fled to Heteno. Even if there isn't that much evidence of a key influx of wealth, there is enough to suggest that the rest of the population did move here. The creatures that populate the land of Hyrule, monsters that change across the game series, all have roots within different fantasy elements. For instance, bokoblins, the most common monster across the series, have fairly direct relations with goblins. However, the monsters that are of most interest are the Hinox, the Lynels, the Gibdos, the Got, and the Gleeok. We'll start with the Hinox. I'll give you a minute. Has a bit of a relation to a certain mythological monster. Yeah, it was the giants and ogres. Oh wait, also the Cyclops. The large man-eating monster is best well known from the Odyssey as a smart and savage giant with one eye that eventually gets outwitted by Odysseus. The Hinox, on the other hand, is a man-eating giant with one eye that isn't the brightest, but can understand basic weaponry and jewelry. Both in the Odyssey and in the game do get defeated if you hit them in the eye, as Odysseus drives a massive pole into the Cyclops' eye. The weak spot for this giant is its eye in the game. The jewelry could suggest that maybe they do eat people and then wear their weapons. Normally around the Hinox you do find a pile of fruit and bones. This could suggest that they do eat animals as well as fruit. This takes quite obvious mythological inspiration, but also more Scandinavian ogre-like qualities. These can be noted by its mannerisms, its little to no intellect and body shape. The Breath of the Wild version merges these two qualities to where it makes sense. Next up is the Lynel is more tricky, but if you haven't noticed, it's half man and half horse. Also a bit of lion for stylistic interest. Although there are mythological creatures that are spliced with lions, the Lynel is much more difficult than the Hinox. Firstly, it is more clever. These enemies are relentless, terrifying if you have played the games. They are highly trained in the weapons they boast, and can shoot arrows from very far away. They do share the nature of a lion, as they can be very territorial. If they see you on their land, they will try to kill you. But if you leave their area, they may still try to kill you, but will probably leave you alone. The centaurs they're based off can be both similar and different. The similarities are with the violent nature, as depictions on the Acropolis show centaurs being aggressive, although this is because of their alcohol intake and sexual intentions. They are shown as a scary enemy, some suggesting they're depicted as a metaphor for barbarians. On the other hand, centaurs can be friendly, as they are the ones who trained a lot of Greek heroes at the time. Gibdos are quite obviously mummies, although they do have different iterations throughout the games, with the most recent one aren't as obvious as the first depictions of them, but they still take place in desert settings. With the god, it looks very similar to the bronze bull that is quite prevalent in Greek mythology and modern iterations of Greek mythology like Percy Jackson. And the Gleeok is kind of obvious, but it's a hydra, 3 heads, although when you cut them off they do not grow back. Luckily, because if you've played Tears of the Kingdom, you know how difficult this is. What is there to say about this franchise that has had everything said about it? Groundbreaking, innovative.
It's very simple. I fused a mushroom to my shield.
Now you have to pay attention because the only way to defeat it is to cut it in the same direction that its mouth is open.
Or just good.
The game of the year goes to The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild.
The team behind the game obviously loved the story of Hyrule, and hopefully there'll be many more incredible games. However, we're not here to glaze. The references and inspiration that the games take from classical civilization can, on the surface, just be seen as copying something cool and playing it in a fantasy game. But looking deeper and coping much more than a sane person would, we can see the story and the significant points in the games are influenced by classical architecture, literature, and history. From the expansion to the Eastern Power, to the monsters, to the temple where we get the sword that seals the darkness, 3D Zelda has been influenced heavily by Romans, Greeks, and other Mediterranean inhabitants. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive. As I said before, massive thank you to Commonwealth Games for the inspiration. Hope you like, subscribe, and have a good day.
All of the joy and warmth I'm feeling right now receiving this award, and put that back into continuing to make Zelda games and continue to try and surprise all of you. So please look forward to that. Thank you!